Job, and we're going to be in chapter 2. So Charlie filled in for me 2 weeks ago, and he covered the first 2 chapters, kind of setting the stage, and we're going to just cover the very last little bit of Job chapter 2, starting in verse 11, and then we're actually going to jump through the entire book and look at all of Job's friends speaking. So we're going to look at Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And we're going to kind of take little vignettes and kind of get to know them as individuals and kind of assess their ability to counsel their friend. So if you want to open up to Job chapter 2, we'll be starting in verse 11. And does somebody want to read verses 11 to the end of the chapter, verses 11, 12, and 13? And get a volunteer to do that this morning. Job 2, 11 through 13. Yep. Thanks, Jacob.
Now, when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamanite. They made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. And they raised their voices and wept. They tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads towards heaven. And they sat down on the ground 7 days, 7 nights. And no one spoke a word to him. For they saw that his suffering was very great.
Job has gone through some suffering, and if you remember from chapter 1, he loses all of his children, he loses all of his wealth and riches, and then he loses his health. And the word of this has spread to his friends and spread abroad. Job's the man of God in the area, and so everyone knows that something isn't quite right. His friends hear of this, and from wherever they happen to live, and there's not really an easy way to determine exactly where they came from. But wherever they lived, they heard of this and they came to sympathize with him, to show him comfort. You know, it's interesting, in verse 12, it says, "And when they saw him, they did not recognize him." Job was so overwrought with grief, with being burdened by the trials that had just come into his life, with the physical affliction in his skin, that they approached him and they hardly even recognized him. So they join him in mourning. How many times have you sat for 7 days in silence? Anybody even actually ever attempted that? I mean, now some of you might be like, I would love to do that. And other people would probably go nuts. But whatever their own individual personalities, they see Job, they see his grief and his pain, and they just sit with him. I don't know how many people would be able to sit in silence for 7 days and not say anything. It's a long time to patiently wait and reflect. But that's what they did. No one spoke a word because they saw his suffering was great. I don't know that any of us have experienced the same level of multiple tragedies on top of multiple tragedies, but we have probably all experienced some sort of tragedy in our life. Something that was unexplained, something that was sudden, something that wasn't anticipated, and we don't know exactly what to do next or how to respond. So what we're going to be looking at over the rest of our Sunday school period this morning is looking at Job's friends and his responses, and their responses to Job. We're going to skip over chapter 3. So they sit in silence for 7 days. They don't say anything, and they wait for Job to speak first. So in verse 1, it says, "After this, Job opened his mouth, and he cursed the day that he was born." So he finally gets to the point that he can put all of his pain into words. And his friends are there, and they haven't left. And he knows that they're going to be there to engage with him, to comfort him, to be a resource. And he opens up. And so what we're going to look at now is not necessarily the content of Job's speech. Charlie's actually going to cover that for me next week. But we're going to look at all of the responses. So when Job speaks, how do his friends respond? So let's jump up to chapter 4, and we're going to look at Eliphaz, his first argument back to Job. So if you want to follow along in Job chapter 4, Job has put forward his first kind of argument where he's wrestling and grappling with the immensity of pain in life and not being able to figure out what's going on. And then Eliphaz answers, he's the first friend to answer, and he says, "If one ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? Yet who can keep from speaking?" And now maybe Eliphaz is more that outgoing, gregarious type person who always has to, be talking. And he's like, "Well, we've waited a long time, and now you finally said something, so are you going to listen to me now that we've been waiting for you?" And it's kind of interesting that that's kind of how he starts. I don't know if that's how you would start if you were talking to a friend in grief. And there's those personal dynamics. Maybe they are really, really good friends, and you just start with, tell them the truth, right? Obviously not from the Midwest. Obviously they're not kind of dancing around the issue a little bit, just getting right after it. Are you going to keep us from speaking? Verse 3, he says, "Behold, you have instructed many, and you have strengthened the weak. And you've kept people from stumbling." So he's going back and saying, this is who you were. You were like that. Verse 5, "But now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. Is not your fear of God your confidence? In the integrity of your ways, your hope?" So Job's like wrestling with just being crushed. And Eliphaz's first thing is, but don't you trust God? And then he flips it right away in verse 7. Somebody want to read verse 7 for me? Chapter 4, verse 7.
"Remember who that was innocent ever perished, or where were the upright cut off?"
So he flips it and he says, you should be trusting in God. You fear God, right? Because if you were innocent, you'd be like all the other innocent people. God doesn't bother them. And right away, there's this direct connection that sets the tone for the rest of the book of Job, where Job's friends are very helpfully trying to figure out what Job did wrong so they can fix it. They can set Job right and get him back on his way. Is that going to fix Job's 10 children who died? It's not. So let's picture this scene. You've just lost all of your material wealth. Your health is the worst it probably could get without you dying. And all of your kids have just died in one tragic accident. And your friends come to comfort you, and they say, trust God. If you were innocent, this wouldn't happen to you. You would probably be like, thank you so much. I needed to be reminded of those truths in this very moment. What about verse 8? They just keep going. Well, as I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap trouble. By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they're consumed. And I mean, they're basically just like looking at Job and being like, see any connection here? Just trying to be super simple, not get too complicated, just speaking the truth in love, you know? We're loving you right now. Just simple truth, 2-3 sentences in, should fix everything. Let's jump down to verse 17. Can mortal man be right before the Lord? Can a man be pure before his Maker? Even in his servants he puts no trust. In his angels he charges with error. How much more so those who dwell in houses of clay? So now Eliphaz is jumping pretty philosophical all of a sudden. Very theological. In that there are fallen angels. This is something they understand. There's not a specific date for when Job was written, but many scholars put it about the time of Abraham. So this is really before God has revealed himself and chosen Israel as a nation. Job's story is probably taking place, given the structure of the language and the types of things they talk about and that kind of stuff. So we're talking about really, really early on in biblical history. They understand that Satan and his angels have fallen to some extent. Now, it doesn't go into a lot of detail here, but he's saying if God has to punish even his angels for disobeying, for being wrong, how much more so us, the people who live in this world mired in sin, where we fall frequently? We're not that good, Job. It's really interesting because Job, up to this point, who can remember what God's statement to Satan is in chapter 1? Does anybody remember? What's that, Vanessa? Yeah! It's, oh, you're wandering around the world looking for people to like poke and prod. Have you seen Job? And Satan's like, yeah, that guy, you've got a hedge of protection around him. I can't touch him. God is the one pointing out a man who is striving to do the best he can do as a human being, as a man made of dust and clay, who is imperfect. Satan kind of takes that challenge and says, if you stop protecting him, I could squeeze him so hard, he would curse you. God says, well, just don't kill him. I think he's going to be faithful. Do you have any friends that it seems like everything just goes right for them? Have you ever been annoyed or frustrated by that? You know, if you think of Job, and at the point in time that we're talking, like, blessed with many children, that was a big thing. Blessed with thousands of flocks and herds of all sorts of types of stuff. Blessed, just blessed, blessed, blessed. And everybody's looking at him as like the pinnacle. But then his friends show up and they're like, not at the top anymore, Job. You know, sometimes as friends, we can let interpersonal feelings kind of drive how we interact and engage with people. And it's hard not to see that maybe Job's friends are kind of a little frustrated with how good his life has been, but now how horrible it is. And you can't jump from there all the way down here, Job. You can't do it. It's just not humanly possible. You must have really messed up. But we're here to help you. Because now we're in a position from a higher elevated status because God hasn't punished us. You know any people that kind of interact with the world that way? Going through Job's friends, it really is a caution to us to be careful about where we see ourselves in that spectrum. Because God doesn't put us on, here's the pinnacle person and here's the person in the depths of whatever, right? God is here for all of us. And we, as His people, need to be with everybody equally all the time, wherever we might land in the spectrum that we create, right? We create the spectrum. How does God view us? There is my child. That one is wandered away, and I need to bring him back. This one is in the fold. I don't have to worry about him as much. God's spectrum is just like a shepherd keeping his sheep. My family is here. Oh, I'm missing someone. I need to nudge them back. We often create a lot more of a spectrum. And we've all got hierarchy and pecking order and social circles and cliques. And I mean, the amount of language that we have for where we place other people in relation to us is crazy. We get caught up in the world system where we're always comparing ourselves to other people. And we have to be careful that we don't do that. I just went on a little bit of a tangent. Sorry about that. Chapter 5. Eliphaz is still speaking. Verse 1. He says, "Call now, is there anyone who can answer you to which the holy ones, and to which of the holy ones will you turn?" He's basically saying, have you even talked to God? Have you spoken to Him? Or maybe you're trying to reach out to some sort of angel and get them to kind of give you some guidance. This is interesting, going back to chapter 4, verse 13. Eliphaz is kind of relying on his own human experience. In chapter 4, verse 13, he says, "Amid thoughts from visions at night, when deep sleep falls on men, dread came upon me and trembling, which made all my bones shake. A spirit glided past my face, and the hair of my flesh stood up. I could not discern its appearance, and its form was before my eyes, but I heard a voice." And so he's basically kind of recounting a dream in which a spirit came to him and was saying, "Are mortal men any better than angels who have fallen from heaven?" So in chapter 5, verse 1, he's kind of relying on that now. He says, who's given you a vision or a dream? Who are you reaching out to get answers to your questions? And then we get verse 6. "Affliction does not come from dust. Trouble doesn't sprout from the ground." Chapter 5, verse 7. "But man is born into trouble as the sparks fly upward." Verse 8. "As for me," speaking from a position of authority now, and You know, if you think of Job being one of the leaders in a community, these are probably other leaders of various communities. It's probably people that are his peers. And so there's probably a little bit of higher level dialogue that's going on, right? Like if two pastors are speaking to each other, it's kind of like, well, from my perspective, the way I see it, the way I read things. So he might not be just antagonistic, but he's trying to communicate, right? As for me, I would seek God, and to God I would commit my cause. Job probably knows this. It's not unhelpful to remind people to keep their focus on God. But the rest of chapter 5, verse 9, he goes on to say, he does great things. Verse 10, he causes rain to come. Verse 11, he saves those weak, lonely, and poor. Verse 12 through 15, he comes against those who are powerful and use their power corruptly. Verse 17, he brings happiness to those he corrects. Blessed is the one whom God reproves. Therefore, despise not the discipline of the Almighty. Verse 22, when destruction comes, you shall laugh and not fear, because God would give you that confidence. And then verses 23 through 27, it's really, God will bless the people who are righteous. In the very last verse there, verse 27, behold, this is what we have searched out, and it is true. So here's your university, college professor, been studying his whole life. Everything that I have studied, scholared out. We've searched it, it's true. So all the stuff I just said, hear and know this for your good. We're here to help, Job. We're here to help. We have to jump up to chapter 15. There's a couple dialogues with Job. Chapter 15. Job's responded, and in verse 1 and 2, Eliphaz answers again, and he says, should a wise man answer with such windy knowledge and fill his belly with the east wind? Super early reference to calling somebody a windbag in a nice way. But Job is like trying to mentally process, and so he's, what about this? And this is how I'm feeling, and he's like responding to his friends. We'll look at more of that next week. But Eliphaz's response, so he goes from, we know these things, God blesses, you need to focus on God, and then he comes back and responds with, boy, you're full of a lot of hot air. Verse 14. What is man that he can be pure, or he who is born of a woman that he can be righteous? And then he repeats his phrase from before. Behold, God puts no trust in his holy ones, and the heavens are not pure in his sight. You know, remember the angels got kicked out of heaven too. So you were good once, Job, but something's up. You know, and Job's like wrestling. I don't think I've done anything wrong. I can't point to anything. Eliphaz is just hammering on that point. It's got to be something, Job. Let's jump up to chapter 22. Again, there's some more dialogue between Job, his friends, comes back to Eliphaz. And he answers again. 22 verse 4. Is it for your fear of him, of God, that he reproves you? Job, don't you realize that if you really feared God, God wouldn't be doing this to you? Verse 5. Is your evil not abundant? Could you imagine walking up to somebody at the funeral of their loved one and saying that? That's just crazy. Now, this is probably fairly long separated from the funerals of his children, right? Because they would have died, probably would have taken care of them right away. The news would have traveled. It would have taken some time for them to travel all the way back. So this is quite some time afterwards. But Job is still suffering physically, and he's lost everything. So it's that state has not changed. So his friends are coming from a different perspective. It's not just like this just happened. It's like, Job, it's been months. And you are in pain and misery, and everything is still not fixed. God's just putting the screws on you. Like, that is their perspective at this point. Chapter 22, verse 23. If you return to the Almighty, you will be built up. Job, we just know you're far from God. So, summarizing then Eliphaz. So this is kind of the end of what he's talking about. I guess in verse 30, he says, He delivers even the one who's not innocent. God will deliver you. And then the next phrase is, who will be delivered through the cleanness of your hands? Like, you need to start cleaning your hands, Job. You need to start turning your direction because you obviously haven't repented of that sin. It's still there. You're not taking the steps. So kind of a summary of Eliphaz's theology. Job is not prospering. Therefore, the innocent people don't die and perish, Job. I mean, we can look at that through our lens of human experience. And he kind of threw out his phrasing in all his chapters that he has responding to Job. He kind of keeps coming back to that. He has his human experience of his dream. He has human experience saying, we know the innocent don't perish, right, Job? We can verify that we've attested to that with our own eyes. And that kind of seems to be kind of his driving thing is, we know from our human experience that this is true. We can look back in history and say, yep, these people were wicked and God destroyed them. His second point seems to be that Job does not fear God. You're not fearing God and it's hindering you. He kind of makes that point in chapter 15. And then here in 22, he's really pointing out that Job's sin is just gross negligence, like beyond what we can explain. He even says that. He says, your sin is abundant. And those are kind of his three main points that he just kind of recycles each time he gets to talk. Eliphaz, based on all his deduction from human experience, from his study, from the spirit that came to him in the dream, he has this feeling that he needs to communicate all this divine judgment is on Job for a reason. To Eliphaz, it's obvious, without a shadow of a doubt, that Job has sinned and he's being punished appropriately. Job's suffering means that his sin is grievous. And at the time, like if you can come and help your brother overcome a fault so that they can be restored to God, isn't that a good thing? It is, if you know what the fault is. But they're showing up and just saying, it's got to be something. What is it, Job? What is it? What is it? And Job's like dialoguing with them, and he's wrestling through that. He's like, if God would just tell me, I could fix it. But he possessed no spiritual insight into what God was actually doing. And I think there's a caution there for all of us, that we have to be careful when we jump to conclusions and assumptions. Right? It's really easy to do. From my perspective, I can see what's going on. But when we don't know what God is doing in their life, we have to be really careful about speaking for God. which is what Eliphaz is doing. God is punishing you. I can see it. I know what God's doing. But do we ever struggle with or get frustrated when somebody is not doing what we think they should be doing? Probably a lot, right? And the further we go along with seeing them ignore what we're telling them and what we think, do we get more patient with them, more kind, more understanding? No, we usually become more blunt, more rude, more impatient, more harsh. Because if we just punch it in, I guess I was following my thought. We just punch it into them, right? Then they understand and then they get it. And you can see that with Job's friends. As they go along, they get harder and harsher. Why are you not getting this, Job? They're trying to get him to understand the truth, but they're really being insensitive because they're not trying to understand it from Job's perspective. They've got their mind made up. Like when Eliphaz starts speaking, okay, I'm laying out what I need to talk about. I've got my talking points. I'll give it to him. He will understand every word I just said and agree with me. And then we can move on. So now we're going to look at Zophar, chapter 11. We've got to go back a couple chapters now. Job chapter 11. So we're going to look at all three of his friends. Zophar's response in chapter 11. So at this point, there's been a little bit of dialogue back and forth. And then Zophar answers and said, "Should a multitude of words go unanswered, and a man full of talk be judged right?" Like he's picking up after, I'm going a little bit out of order for a reason, but he's kind of picking up in the middle of the conversation. So Eliphaz went first, Job responded, there's a response from Bildad, but then Zophar jumps in, he's like, hey, I've got something to say too. But you've been talking a whole bunch, Job, and I need to answer you. Should a man full of talk be judged right? Should your babble silence men, and when you mock, should no one shame you? Like, Zophar is jumping into that elevated stage right off the bat. He's offended. He is coming to counsel his friend, and he got offended. I'm here to help you, Job, and you do not see this. Have you ever jumped to like level 9 from 0, like right off the bat in a conversation? Like just the way the person like talks to you or looks at you, like those first couple things, and you're just like, oh, it's on. Like it is so on right now. But is that helpful? I've been reading a lot about a lot of like psychology type things recently, and I ran across something that somebody shared, and I thought it was helpful. And it's like, if you think of a big triangle that's upside down, an inverted triangle, if you put acting at the bottom and feeling in the middle and thinking on the top, our brains and our bodies physiologically are hardwired from when we were born to start at the bottom of the pyramid with the shortest amount of time. So our brains automatically start doing stuff physiologically. You smell smoke, and it triggers something. Like you start to fall, and your body will just start to catch yourself without you even thinking about it. So our bodies are geared physiologically to act and react right away. Like if we feel like we're in danger, you start to tense up. Like you almost don't even have to think about it. So action comes first. Once our bodies start to respond, then it kicks in our hormones and we start to feel things like, should I feel afraid? Should I feel, calm? What should I feel right now? So it's our body kicks in with an action. Our feelings start to engage so that we have the appropriate response. But thinking is the last thing on that spectrum. where our brain actually can process all the information and then respond appropriately. Right? Does that make sense? Here are a whole bunch of guys who are really old, probably. I mean, if they're Job's peers, he's got 10 kids. That doesn't just happen like, you got at least a decade, so, there's a amount of time. I suppose he could have had triplets or something. Yeah, I'll grant you that. But it would have taken a while to get a whole bunch of kids who were adults and old enough to go to a party, right? It would have taken a while, unless he inherited everything from his dad, to build up all these flocks and herds and all this stuff. So, Job's kind of gone along through life, and his friends probably have too. Zophar, here's this man, should be a man of understanding and wisdom. I mean, it's like, hey, we're buddies. We should all go check up on Job, And Eliphaz was like, we've studied this, Job. We know what the right answers are. We've been around the block. And Zophar, how does he respond? He responds by saying, you mock us? I cannot let that go unanswered. That's the first thing out of his mouth. I just came and sat with you for 7 days in silence. You're going to mock me for it? I'm going to mock you back. I'm going to take you to task. He wasn't mocking his friend. When you look at it next week, Job's not mocking anybody. He's just wrestling. He's grieving. He's in pain. He doesn't know what's going on, and he's trying to use his friends to help him understand the world. Jump to verse 11. He's talking about God. Chapter 11, verse 11. For God knows worthless men when he sees their iniquity. Will he not consider it? God knows all about you, Job. We don't know it. You should confess it to us. We can help you work through it. But God knows it. Verse 20. But the eyes of the wicked will fail. All the way of escape will be lost, and their hope is to breathe their last. God's judgment's coming. Zophar jumps with, oh, I'm so mad at you right now. All the things you're talking about. You're not listening to Eliphaz. You're not listening to Bildad. I need to verbally punch you in the face and smack you around so you can understand what we're saying. Jump up to verse 20, or chapter 20. So Job speaks, Eliphaz speaks, Bildad speaks. Zophar comes back in chapter 20. Verse 2. Job, you've been talking, and my thoughts answer me because of my haste within me. His mind is racing. And it's almost as if my words cannot get out of my mouth fast enough to correct you. And he goes back to this same thing. I hear censor that insults me, and out of my understanding a spirit answers me. I am super frustrated with you. Do you know what comes the chapter just before this? Chapter 19. Does anybody have that heading title for chapter 19? What does it say? This is where Job wrestles and he says, all this stuff happened, but I know the foundational truth that I have to rest on is that as my Redeemer lives. How does Zophar respond to that? Have you ever been in one of those dialogues where you're just talking past each other? That is so happening right here. Nobody actually is responding to what Job is actually saying. There's no affirmation of that truth. So he says, you're censoring me. I feel all this frustration in my heart. Then he goes to verse 10. Chapter 20, verse 10. His children seek the favor of the poor, and his hands will give back all of his wealth. This is the sinful man. His bones were full of youthful vigor, but they will lie with him in dust. he just hits all three things that Job just suffered. Yeah, your kids, trash. Your wealth, gone. Oh yeah, your body, that too. Oh look, Job, that's you. Then you skip down to the end, verse 29. This is the wicked man's portion from God, the heritage decreed for him. Where is the affirmation of the truth that Job just said? It's not there. It doesn't exist. When we are engaging people, we need to make sure that our preconceived notions don't come to the forefront. We need to make sure that when we're actually talking to people, we're actually listening to what they say and not what we think that they're saying. You know, that means we got to stop, set aside our stuff, and it's really hard to do that sometimes. But we've got thoughts running through our head, and it's really easy to jump to conclusions and then frame everything in that conclusion. I was just at a conference and for the military, and we had this civilian guy who was coming in and trying to talk about this concept, and everybody in the room were giving him answers to a question he proposed, and I could see him reframing every question in one direction so that they would all know what he was saying. And everybody else was really not on the same page because they wanted to talk about something different. And it was meant to be a dialogue, but this guy reframed every question to point to his one conclusion he wanted everybody to get to. We have to be aware that we often do that. I do that with my children. I'll admit it. Son, are you seeing what I'm saying here? But Dad, you know, like I need to slow down because he's not on the same page that I am on. He's not looking in the same direction. And that's the hard part. Whenever we're in these kind of situations, we need to stop and slow down long enough to make sure that we're both looking in the same direction. Job's looking this way at God. I know my Redeemer lives. I don't know how to square that with my life and how I feel right now. But my Redeemer lives, and I will hold that truth. And all of his friends are looking the other way and being like, Job, your past, it must be messed up. God blessed you, blessing's gone. Like, let's go digging in your past and try to find the thing. So Zophar's theology, it's really like two things. You deserve worse than you got, Job. I didn't read this, chapter 11, verse 6. And he would tell the secrets of wisdom, for his manifold is understanding. Know that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves. Basically, Job just didn't die. They're like, you should have died, Job. So his theology is you deserve worse than you got, and those who commit wickedness really do suffer for it. Case in point, your life, Job. I mean, those are his 2 points. That's all he really gets after. It's like, it could be worse, Job. Have you ever said that to somebody? Could be worse. I think it's probably one of the most simple responses because we're like, well, yeah, I mean, more people could have died, or you could have lost more of your health, or like it could be worse. Like that perspective is supposed to help them in their grief. I would caution anybody from pretty much ever using it could be worse. Like we should strike it from the vocabulary of anything for every person for all time. You know, Zophar is really focused on a religious dogmatism. He has very religious arguments. If Job would only turn and repent, God would pardon and restore. He's very harsh with his language. There's no love in anything that he says. In religious communities like ours, it's very easy for people to jump to that. Like, I know what the Bible says. Bible's black and white. Boom. Take the truth. Take 2 pills in the morning and you'll be fine. Like, go to bed, wake up. Like, that's not quite how the Bible works. That's not how God works. That's not how our grief works. Zophar is actually presuming to know God. And you'll find that there's some similarities here, right? He's presuming to know God, and he's pleading God's case from a man's finite point of view. It's kind of interesting. But we should all remember that God is more complex than any one aspect of his character, and Zophar is really just hammering judgment. But, we often have a tendency to focus on one aspect of God's character because that's really all we can grasp at any one point in time. When you think of the totality, God perfectly holds justice and mercy and grace and love and discipline, all perfectly. We usually are like grab an aspect of God and then apply it to a situation, the one that we think fits. That's what Job's friends are doing. We'll have to kind of hurry through Bildad. Bildad, chapter 8. So he's the second one to respond to Job. And again, he starts off, so Eliphaz was first, Bildad second in responses. His response in verse 2, chapter 8, verse 2. How long will you say these things and the words of your mouth be a great wind? His friends are really jumping in hard and fast. Job, you started talking, you opened up the floodgates. We've been sitting in silence for way too long. Boom. And he does the same thing. Verse 3, does God pervert justice? Answer that question, Job. Is this the justice of God? 3 of us think it is, 1 doesn't. We took a vote, we win. If we jump up to verse 8, for inquiry, please, bygone ages, and consider what our fathers have searched out. So he's kind of appealing to that philosophical thing, that kind of history, what history has to say. For we are but of yesterday and know nothing, and our days are shadow. And he's kind of trying to, you're right, Job, we don't know much. But will they not teach you and tell you to utter words out of their understanding? So if we look back in the past, our teachers will tell us what we should do right now. So stop talking. We need to do more listening, researching, considering. Verse 20, chapter 8. Behold, God will not reject the blameless. So there's this kind of point and counterpoint that they're making, where it's like, Job, if we kind of observe in this one area of our lives, that should give us the answer. But when we observe your life and apply that understanding, we don't see that matching up. Are you seeing what we're getting at? Chapter 18. Bildad speaks again. How long, verse 2, how long will you hunt for words and consider, and then we will speak? Why are we counted as cattle, and why are we stupid in your sight? All of his friends are really, really frustrated with Job. Like, as they go on longer and longer in this conversation, it's interesting they don't just say, hey, let's take a break. Obviously, we're not on the same page. We'll come back and visit you another time. No, we are going to make you understand. You will understand by the time we get done with you. Chapter 25. We are getting towards the end, and Bildad responds in just a couple verses. He's like, dominion and fear are with God, verse 2. He makes peace in heaven. Is there any number to his armies? Upon whom does his light not arise? How then can man be right before God? How can he who is born of a woman be pure? Behold, even the moon is not bright. The stars are not pure. How much less man who's a maggot, the son of a worm? All right, mic drop. That's the last thing he says. And you can tell that as they go on in the discussion, they're just so frustrated. They're just like, Job, you are so sinful. Just admit it. He's really appealing to wisdom and philosophy and tradition gathered by his fathers, which we read in chapter 8. Bildad sought to convince Job of his wrong. Bildad has the last word. So out of all three of the friends, this is the last thing Job hears from the three of them. Let's go out on a positive note, guys. Let's call this guy a dirt worm, right? Like, you are so hideous. You're a maggot. But you know what? This is the conclusion of, let's summarize everything that we talked about. He kind of starts with, God's up there doing his thing, and Job, you're just dirt. But they don't really talk about the issue at all. His conclusion comes out half-hearted and empty. There's really no weight to it. Like, what is it they're trying to get him to do? They just think that he needs to repent of some sin that is unnamed. And that's as far as they got. He moves from a very specific argument at the beginning to something super general that could apply to just about anybody in any space and time at the end. Because they really have nothing specific to pin to Job. So, we got to wrap up. We've seen Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar kind of bring human experience, human philosophy, and even kind of bringing moral justice and law into their argumentation. And even though there was some slight variation, there were more similarities. They all pointed to Job and said, you have some unseen sin. They all recognized that God is working, but they were only working in the direction that they thought. They all directed him simply to repent and ask God to forgive. We're often uncomfortable being around people in their grief. And it's a lot easier to talk about all the other things. But what if they had just heard from Job in his grief? And just listened for a while? Job's friends really have a syllogistic reasoning. It's just a philosophy term that says, if this, A, then this, B. And they're saying, if God punishes sinful people and you have all this calamity happen to you, then therefore you must be a sinful person. But interestingly, we have a perspective that Job's friends didn't. And that's the narrator in verse 1. Job's suffering is part of an unseen cosmic battle where an accuser is waging war against God's servants. We often forget this enemy is at work sometimes. But we have to be cautious not to overread every single circumstance as always Satan causing things to happen, right? It's not always the devil made me do it. But we as Christians need to always keep in the back of the mind that we're wrestling against more than flesh and blood. So, what can we learn from Job's friends? If you've spent any time wrestling with a friend who's suffering, maybe you've felt how hard it is to sit in silence and how uncomfortable that can be. Our instinct is to try and identify some sort of solution, and it's easy to think that we can help by eliminating whatever that cause is. Guys are really good at this. Just give me the cause, I'll get my tools, we'll get it fixed, we can move on. Thank you very much. Right? Yeah. And really, that's what Job's friends are doing. They really are. Classic guy tactics. But it's almost as if we would rather give some sort of reason for suffering, whether it's right or wrong, so that we can make it non-mysterious anymore, so we can make it tangible, so we can give it some sort of box to put it in. So I think that there's a lot that we can learn not to do from Job's friends. But I would say that how they started is probably where we should start as they approach him. They found ways to show that they are present and that they saw him in his grief. They cried, they wept, they tore their clothes, they sat with him, and they engaged with him in a physical way. When somebody's grieving, there's nothing wrong with showing up, putting your arm around them, and just crying with them. They did that for 7 days. But then they're like, all right, Job, now we got to move on. But Job wasn't ready to move on. So there's a balance there where we have to be very delicate moving into that next stage. And I think this next thing was another good thing that they did. They waited for the grieving individual to initiate the conversation. Don't come up and say, could be worse. Don't even say anything. Just sit there. Let them start the conversation. Let them kind of navigate where they're at. And then you're kind of just coming along to witness and let them know that they're not alone. Now, we're not going to go into all the specifics of what kind of counsel we should give today. But we're just looking at from Job's friends. There's an example of something they did good and a whole bunch of what they didn't do good. And most of it was if they would have just kept quiet and let Job process, they would have been in a much better place. So be careful that we don't jump to knowing. That's what all of his friends did. If you notice that throughout, God says, God does, God wants. They didn't even have the Bible. There's nothing wrong with pointing them to God, but there's a difference between us saying we know what God wants for you. So a few things for you to take away this morning. Hopefully that's helpful. Love to talk more about it, and we'll look at Job's side of the story next week. So let's close in prayer. Thank you, Lord, for a little bit of time.